So to continue my exploration of the selection API in the browser, I thought it would be fun to create a medium-inspired directive in Angular 5.2.10 that would allow me to render some sort of call to action based on the position or location of a selected text bounding box. So if you haven't used Medium before, essentially what it allows you to do is select some text, and then above the text will be rendered usually some sort of social call to action, whether it's tweeting the text or starting a comment thread to spark conversation with other readers. So I wanted to see if I could recreate that, or at least an experiment to recreate that using an Angular directive. So you can see here that I've selected text and nothing's happened. I've selected text up here and nothing's happened. And that's because if we look down here in the DOM, what you'll see is that I have this div here called class container, and on this container I have my experimental directive, which will only react to selections contained within the container itself. So if I select, say, love is not enough here, what you'll see is that I get this text select event emitted from the directive that contains the selected text. It contains a viewport relative position, meaning the bounding box of this selection relative to the viewport. It also contains a host position or host rectangle here, which is the bounding box of the selection relative to that div.container that we saw earlier. So which is why you can see that the top for the host is only 44, but the top for the viewport is 243 because it's much farther away than the div container. And here I can click on the call to action. You can see shared text, love is not enough, and then I deselect the selection, which of course triggers a clearing of the text select as well as any rectangles associated with it. And the idea was that it will always center above the selection. So you can see here now that I have a selection that spans the whole thing. Share here is in the middle. If I went to something just over here, it's centered, and again it's centered here. And you'll notice that it scrolls with the document, and that's because if we look at if we look at this call to action, what you'll see is that it's inside a container here, an indicator, and that indicator is itself contained within the container. So that's why we can get that host relative position and use it to absolutely position the indicator inside of the container within which the text select event is emitted. So let's go ahead and take a look at how this works. So here's my app component that consumes the text select directive, and the directive here exposes a text select event, but the text select is also the attribute selector for the directive. So the text select token here defines both the selector for the directive as well as the name of the output binding. So this will react to selections that take place inside this container. It'll emit an event, which I'm going to capture here. And if we look down at the event handler, here you can see is where I'm outputting the selected text and the rectangles. And in this case, if we scroll back up, we can see that inside of this container, I have my indicator, and that indicator is being positioned based on the host rectangle portion of the emitted event. And here's my call to action. The markup for the call to action is a little bit more complicated than it would necessarily be, or that it would otherwise be, because we're dealing with selections, and I don't want to accidentally deselect the text by interacting with the call to action, which is why I'm binding to mouse down and mouse up and preventing defaults and stopping propagation. This is all to essentially, when I select here, when I click on this, I don't want to deselect the text. Or when I mouse down, so I've just moused down, you can see that I did not deselect the text, and that's because that mouse down event has been prevented its default behavior. Okay, so jumping back, let's go ahead and take a look at what the text select directive is. So here's the text select directive, and you can see that its selector is the attribute text select, but I am also exposing the output binding text select. Internally, that binding is actually called text select event, just to make it a little bit more clear internally what it is, but to keep the API simple, I'm calling it just text select. Now, Probably the most interesting thing about this directive is that there is not a one-to-one ratio of DOM interactions to events, meaning that, for example, if we look back here, if I start clicking inside here, but I bleed over outside of the container, that there's no event that takes place. Similarly, if I start selecting outside of the container and drag into the container, there's no text selection event. And that's because we only want to deal with selections that are contained wholly within the container, which means that there's a bunch of events here that I can listen to that don't necessarily lead to a change in the view model state. As such, in my ng on init event handler, I'm going to set up my event bindings outside of the Angular context. And what this allows me to do is bind some handlers that, when fired, don't automatically trigger Angular's change detection. I only end up triggering change detection down here when I'm processing the selection, and I note that I have I run into a situation where I have to actually call next on the textSelect event. Actually, I think this is supposed to be emit, but I'll fix that later. So this one's selecting the empty text, and this one is selecting non-empty text, and it has actual rectangles. And you can see both of these end up dipping back into the Angular zone in order to trigger an event that could theoretically change the view model state. Therefore, it needs to trigger change detection. The rest of this is really just dealing with the selection and getting the bounding boxes and then translating the bounding box from the viewport to the local and emitting that. So there's really not a ton of stuff in here, but anyway, I think now that I'm saying this out loud, I think I probably have some bugs in here relating to adding this. This might need to be done outside the Angular zone. I have to double check on that. I actually don't know if binding this and then reacting to the handler and then binding a new thing will still be outside the Angular zone, or if it's now inside the Angular zone. I'll double check on that, unrelated. Anyway, it's just a fun experiment, and I thought that was kind of a fun feature of Medium, and I wanted to see if I could come up with a way to recreate it in Angular that tried to create a clean separation of concerns. The separation of concerns is not quite as clean as I would like it to be. For example, when I go to actually share the selected text, you see here that I'm calling the document getSelection to remove all the ranges, so that triggers a removal of the current or clearing of the current selection. I would have loved for the concept of selection to be wholly owned by the textSelect directive, but you can see here selection is indeed kind of bleeding across the boundary of the directive and the consuming context. There might be a better way to do that. I don't necessarily, I might have to make the directive itself a little less generic, maybe a little bit more targeted towards a use case, but this seems like a fairly decent separation of concerns, and if nothing else, just a fun experiment to sort of spark future thought on the matter.